Hi, everyone. I want to start to delve into um, some of the issues that South Africa has faced in the 21st century. We cannot, in the scope of this course, really do justice to a lot of this, and some of this would really be more germane for a political science course on kind of current African issues. And South Africa shares a lot of the problems that and opportunities that other countries on the continent have. But of course, given its legacy of apartheid and some of the other unique characteristics that it has, it certainly has its own history and its own set of issues. To start with, um, one of the things that has become all too apparent, and that's largely a negative, I think, although, there is, I mean, I suppose it does present some stability, is that the ANC, which led, of course, the freedom struggle against the apartheid regime, which saw its great victories with the Mandela election in 1994, has somewhat predictably continued to maintain dominance. And this is where South Africa holds its political history, recent political history, in common with many other African countries, where the liberation movement to free the country from the yoke of colonialism and European dominance has morphed into a dominant political party. And South Africa has essentially been, for the last 25 plus years now, a one party state. There has yet to emerge a truly viable competitor to the African National Congress. Now, this would be all well and good if the leaders of the ANC, you know, acted in ways that were entirely with the interests of the country and the people in mind. But unfortunately, that has not always been the case. This has been readily apparent, especially during the presidency of Jacob Zuma. And so South Africa is now currently on its fifth president. Cyril Ramaphosa became president of South Africa at the very end of, or I should say, the beginning of 2018. Um, and so, from Mandela to Thabo Mbeki to the brief presidency of Malema to the fraught presidency of Jacob Zuma, and now the presidency of Cyril Ramaphosa, all of these individuals are ANC, right? And they, in a way, with the exception of Motlanthe, have all been kind of the heir apparent to the previous president, though that has not always been without its problems. The beginning of the presidency of Thabo Mbeki was met with a tremendous amount of optimism that the country was on the right course, that Mandela had shepherded the country through the transition to democracy, that he had accomplished, despite huge challenges, accomplished a fair amount, and that South Africa was trending upward. Um, and Thabo Mbeki was nearly universally respected. He has a very gentlemanly demeanor. He's also, somewhat of an intellectual. He began to talk about South Africa leading an African Renaissance, that the entire continent would take its cues from South Africa, which was developing by leaps and bounds, and this was going to spill over into other countries. But Mbeki's intellectual nature and his, frankly, reserved demeanor is something that ultimately hurt him as a politician. He came to, when the problems continued to mount, and some of these exacerbated by some of the decisions that Mbeki made, he came to be seen as remote and unapproachable. Somebody who was not much interested in the common people. He lacked a common touch. And he was increasingly kind of overshadowed or uh, had to make way for the populist, extremely popular, and in some way relatable figure of Jacob Zuma, who was his deputy president. But Zuma was shrouded, surrounded by controversy. So this dynamic between Mbeki and Zuma was highly problematic, and there's serious fallout from that. Um, Mbeki's handling of some of the country's greatest crises, especially AIDS, which I'll talk about in a few minutes here, um, left him not only unpopular in South Africa itself, but also um, with an international, a highly damaged international reputation. And that stigma that is attached to Mbeki because of his handling of AIDS has never really passed. He has continued to be very active in the international sphere. There's even been talk at times of him returning to South African politics, but Thabo Mbeki is very much an international figure, but not without controversy. When Mbeki faced a vote of no confidence and a wave of support brought Jacob Zuma into the presidency of the ANC, Mbeki was forced to resign in mid-2008, a few months short of the conclusion of his term as South African president. This left the country in another state of transition. It was fairly obvious at that point that Jacob Zuma, who enjoyed tremendous popularity, was going to be the next president, was going to win the next election. But they needed to, because Mbeki stepped down, they needed to find someone to act as a caretaker president. Zuma himself suggested Kgalema Motlanthe, who was an uncontroversial figure, one who was highly respected, but also one who lacked any sort of popular following or really any major allies within the ANC or within the government itself. Understanding, sort of seeing the writing on the wall, Mbeki appointed Motlanthe to his cabinet in the waning days of his presidency, and when Mbeki stepped down, Motlanthe took over as president. This lasted only for 6 months. For the most part, Motlanthe was highly respected, and later he would emerge as a potential rival to Jacob Zuma during the 2012 campaign for. So the ANC chooses its president a couple of years removed from the general election. And so in 2012, there was a kind of campaign for to see who would head the ANC. Jacob Zuma had been doing it since 2007, and Motlanthe, initially somewhat reluctantly, but then with some gusto, sort of threw his hat into the ring as a candidate, and in a conference, somewhat controversial conference in Mangaung near Bloemfontein, Motlanthe was defeated soundly by Jacob Zuma, and so he had a brief kind of resurgence, but the Zuma machine, we might call it, quashed his ambitions, and Motlanthe sort of retired into private life again. I'll have plenty to say when we look at different issues about the presidency of Jacob Zuma, which unfortunately is really the definitive one of the early part of the 21st century. Zuma was a man of the people. He had liberation struggle credentials. He had spent 10 years on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela, though not necessarily terribly close to Nelson Mandela. But that gave him those sorts of credentials, a reputation as a freedom fighter. Jacob Zuma lacked the education that Thabo Mbeki had. In fact, he had no formal education at all. He also was a Zulu, which was in some ways important given the ethnic divisions in the country between the ANC and the IFP, and the kind of problems that had created during the transition from apartheid to democracy. Zuma, a Zulu member of the ANC, was able to harness a significant Zulu following, and really more and more render the IFP a marginal party in alliance with the ANC. So for a number of reasons, Zuma emerged with tremendous popularity. He was seen as a man of the people, someone who represented the interests of common South Africans, farm workers and factory workers, the uneducated crowd, which was a significant part of the population given the lack of opportunities that people had. So Zuma was seen as far more relatable than Thabo Mbeki. But on the other hand, his political life, not just his presidency, I mean, there was has been marred by controversy. There was controversy long before he ever assumed the presidency. Charges of rape, charges of extortion, charges of embezzling money from the government. And Zuma somehow survived all of that. But into his presidency, there continued to be serious accusations of corruption, some of these fairly obvious. And it was only Zuma's manipulation of things like the judiciary and the press that he was able to remain in the presidency for as long as he was. When he was forced to resign at the end of 2017 from the presidency of the ANC, and then at the beginning of 2018 from the presidency of South Africa itself, this was done in disgrace. And many South Africans said, how did he possibly hang on that long given all of the charges of corruption that were swirling around this guy? It was rather remarkable. And to some extent, his replacement, Cyril Ramaphosa, was seen in South Africa as more of the same, even though Ramaphosa doesn't have nearly the scandalous reputation that Zuma did. There are other things about Ramaphosa. He has amassed a huge fortune largely through handling government tenders, government contracts. Become a billionaire and reemerged into politics largely because of political patronage, and this has sort of stuck to him. He was also very supportive of Jacob Zuma, was his deputy president, and was seen as the heir apparent. And so, the some of the problems that Zuma had continued to stick to Ramaphosa. Though his presidency thus far has not been nearly so mired in scandal as Zuma's was. The opposition, such as it was quite vocal and vehement in its opposition to the ANC. And the future politics of South Africa are going to depend largely on the ability of one or a coalition of these parties gaining some traction with the electorate. The ANC has continued to enjoy votes in every election, well above a majority, though starting with the 2009 election, not a supermajority. The 2009 election, the ANC received 65.9% of the votes, so they were about a tenth of a percentage away from a supermajority, from a two-thirds majority in the South African Parliament, but those numbers have continued to go down, largely because the Democratic Alliance, which emerged sort of out of this was a merger of several parties during the first term of Thabo Mbeki's presidency. The National Party had become almost entirely defunct at that point. There was a group who started what was called the New National Party. There was a Democratic Party already in existence, and a few of these minor parties came together to form the Democratic Alliance. The National Party fizzled out by 2005, and the Democratic Alliance took the place of the major contender against the ANC. In the most recent elections, the Democratic Alliance has begun to approach about a fourth of the votes. I think it was 24% in 2014, and I'm not sure what it was in 2019. But this is the most viable opposition. During the presidency of Malema Motlanthe, some members of the ANC who were opposed to Jacob Zuma, who were worried about the consequences of appointing someone like him to be president, broke away from the ANC and formed a new party called the Congress of the People, usually COPE for short. And they were seen by some, at least, as traitors to the ANC cause. But this began to attract some serious attention. Now, it has never gained more than a few percentage points in any election, only a few seats, but some people of fairly high reputation have attached their name to this. One was Helen Suzman, who had been the progressive member of parliament during apartheid, the only one really for a very long time in the 60s and 70s who opposed apartheid actively. And was seen with real liberation credentials. She joined the Congress of the People, and this led somehow, inexplicably, to accusations that she was a racist. And this tended to be the card that the ANC leaders, especially Zuma, played, though Mbeki himself used that many times as well. Another person who has supported the Congress of the People is Nelson Mandela's second wife, Gracia Machel, and this despite Mandela himself, of course, being the guiding spirit of the ANC, and that continues to be the case. A more controversial opposition emerged in the person of Julius Malema, pictured here at the bottom. Malema was the head of the ANC Youth League, which, of course, as an organization, had a very storied history. But Malema was evicted from the ANC during Mbeki's presidency because of his blatantly racist policy suggestions. Specifically the forcible removal of land from white landowners and its transfer to poor black people. And this was to be done, sort of by force without any recourse to law or anything like that, right? And so Malema was suggesting things that had been tried in Zimbabwe with the result of a lot of violence. And that was only one of Malema's suggestions, and so he was seen as too controversial, ended up out of the ANC, and came to form his own party, which he called the Economic Freedom Fighters. And Malema, sorry for the yawn, Malema has continued his economic populism. And really, as you can see, the EFF, many of the leaders and followers wear these red berets. They act almost as a kind of paramilitary organization on the left. There's a lot of tactics of intimidation and things like this. And so this is can, I suppose, be seen as somewhat dangerous element on the left of the political spectrum. Okay. All right, so that's enough for this one. We will get into the major issues that have animated South Africa in the 21st century and return to the actions of some of these figures in the next lecture.